welcome to episode 7 of Truth and Love Apologetics. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the Kalam Cosmological argument.
Yep.
Well, to get us started, you want to tell us what that is, Jaron?
Yeah, we'll start by talking about that. So it's basically a syllogism, which is just a logical construction. It comes out in multiple premises and a conclusion. And when the two premises, or however many premises are in the argument, are true, the conclusion is automatically true. And it is formed like this. So everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe, that was premise one. The second one is the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion after that, those two premises, is that therefore the universe had a cause.
All right, so we got these two premises that lead to that conclusion. Maybe we should break down how we know each premise is true. So let's start with that first premise. How do we know that everything that begins to exist has a cause?
Yeah, that's a good question. On experience alone, everything that has ever been in finite existence has some type of cause, whether it's this table or buildings or humanity, whatever the case is, there's always something that precedes it, and there's almost this chain reaction due to certain things happening, then this product comes about. In its sense of this table, it kind of starts in somebody's mind. It's a concept, it's an idea, and then they take that idea and they put it and use physical materials to put it into existence and make it actual. So that's 100% of our experience of anything in this finite, in this universe that we experience that begins existing. It's always the case that there was a cause that preceded it. And it's, I think, too, like, imagine you and I are sitting right here, and I don't think at any point in time I'm worried about an elephant all of a sudden popping into existence out of nowhere and crushing the two of us, and, containing this entire room, giving us no escape whatsoever, and crushing the life out of both of us. It's not something I live in fear of or in any state of worry.
Yeah. Something can't come out of nothing.
No, that's... And it's been bottled up into a nice little phrase, which is ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing, nothing comes. Yeah. And that is just completely representative of every one of our experiences.
Yeah, it's just basic common sense, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, basic experience, and that's hard to argue against 100% experience on how cause and effect work. That there being some kind of cause for some type of effect to come into being or to happen and begin to exist or begin to be.
Okay, so we know that everything that began to exist has a cause. Now, how do we know with the second premise that the universe began to exist?
Yeah. I think that... So there's a couple of things here that I wanted to talk about. There's some philosophical underpinnings about infinity. So, infinite in and of itself defined is that you basically can't accomplish, say, counting to or getting to the end of this thing. It's always one more than any series in a set of numbers. So with the concept of infinite, it doesn't have an end and it doesn't have a beginning. So with the universe that we're in, we see much different things than something like that. Like, for instance, we're in this particular series of events through our lifetime, this present moment right now. But what we would have to, like in an infinite universe, there never would have been a start point or a set of those sequence of events in our life to get to this particular point and moment in time. So we basically end up having like this infinite regress problem where you're always moving the needle back, never to a point when something actually began, at least without a timeless, infinite cause outside of this reality in which we live right here. So just philosophically, there's never a starting point to get to this specific moment in time, if the universe was in fact infinite. So philosophically, it just doesn't work. But then also there's other things, like, so this is an argument that doesn't just lend itself to only philosophical ideas and concepts. It has scientific concepts within it that support it and prove it. And we don't really need to get into whatever details about the timeline of some Big Bang concept, but that being the cosmological or the way that people perceive and understand the universe to have come into existence. I'm not saying in a material way where it could have accomplished itself on its own, nothing like that, but saying it had a single point in time when it began and is actively expanding at this present moment in time. And it's expanding in all directions to where if you were to rewind it, like if you were to put the universe in a DVD player and hit rewind, as everything went in backwards in the opposite direction of its current expansion, it would boil down to a single point in time, a point of ultimately nothingness where something popped into existence and then had this massive amount of heat and energy and exploded and expanded rapidly into the universe that we currently have. So you have cosmological evidence like that as well. But not only that either, you have, like the second law of thermodynamics, which we were joking about the temperature of this room earlier.
Yeah, it's hot in here.
It is very hot in here. But heat, this law of entropy where everything moves to this state of disorder, and heat has this ability to come, everything has this tendency to come to an equilibrium, and heat constantly moving to a cold state. Mm-hmm. And right now we have concentrated heat that produces life. But if the universe had infinitely existed, everything would have already moved to that state of equilibrium, and we'd be in a state of cold death. There'd be no life here. So that is also something that rules out the nature of an infinite universe, the one in which we exist.
So premise one, everything that begins to exist has a cause, which is just logically obvious.
Yeah.
Premise two, the universe began to exist, which is logically necessary and scientifically almost essentially unanimously proven, right?
Yes.
There's not much in the scientific community that disagrees with this premise that the universe began to exist. So if that plus that, then we get to the conclusion, which is
that the universe has a cause.
Yep. 2 + 2 = 4. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist.
Yeah.
That plus that equals the universe has a cause.
That's right.
Now,
a lot of mathing going on here.
It's just not too much math. I think it's pretty straightforward. But that's these premises necessarily lead to that conclusion, right?
Yeah.
But there's something more to this argument than just the universe has a cause.
Yeah.
How does that point us to a personal God that created a universe? How does that get to not necessarily Christianity, but at least theism, or the belief that a God must exist in order for this universe to exist?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned this whole concept of the way that logical argument is constructed, which means if those two premises are true, which by the things we're saying, and those two premises are rock solid, which means that
The conclusion.
That's right. That there was a cause.
Yeah.
So apart from that, so we don't. This argument, like you suggested, is not something that gets us to Christianity, and hopefully we'll talk about that in just a bit, how it can be used and what it can accomplish, because we don't want to say an argument can accomplish more than it can, because that really reduces our credibility when it comes to us having these conversations with people. But maybe this analogy will help. So when you think about something like an infinite, eternally existing being, if the universe comes into existence and this being is not a personal agent, one that has free will and the choice to create at some specific moment in time, to create time and do that at a specific moment in its eternal existence, then what you have are basically a set of conditions. So what happens when ice gets put in a 33 degree Fahrenheit temperature?
Very slowly starts to melt.
It starts to melt, but it doesn't just choose to do that. The conditions are the temperature is this, so the ice turns to water eventually. That's very slow melting at that temperature. So in the same sense, if this eternal being that we're discussing, that we describe as a personal, free will, creative agent, God, the God of the Bible, then that being would not be one that is personal and not one that is has free will or has agent or chooses, because what would happen is in the existence of that eternal being, if it was just personal, like lacked free will, lacked agency, then when its existence came into being, then the universe would have just been a natural set of conditions that happened, and so it would share the same exact eternality and infinite state that this eternal being did. And that is, again, not what we see, as we've already discussed already at this point. So something like that is very confidence producing, for the fact that this being is not something that is lacks personality, or is that this just mindless being. But also, we exist in time and in space. So this being that we're talking about, because of the cosmological argument, has to be outside of time and space, because it can't create a system that it's already in. The system would have to exist prior to, for anything else to be inside that system, in this instance, the universe. So for this being to create the universe, it has to be outside of time and space. So timeless and spaceless. And those are features of really only three major religions, which is Christianity, Judaism, and then Islam. So that's all we really have. And the features of this argument make it just so that this eternal being needs to be a personal being. It needs to have free agency. It needs to have a will to create at a specific moment in time throughout the eternality of its existence, or of this being's existence. And it also has to be incredibly powerful to accomplish all this. And it has to exist outside of it, which are all the features of the God of the Bible.
He fits the...
He fits the mold.
Yep.
Yeah.
The mold he created.
So we kind of talked about the personal cause aspect of things here.
So why do you think this is important? How can, let's say, the average listening Christian, how can they apply this to their lives as they maybe try to talk to someone who isn't a Christian? How does this apply to them?
Well, I think that the argument is a really good one. It's useful because it is a way to... It's something you can use to engage somebody who already makes a claim of something like, science has disproven God. Well, then you institute this cosmological argument, and there's really no way after presenting this that you don't get something of this eternal being that exists timelessly, spacelessly, with great power that's personal, with agency and a will. And so this takes away the footing of a statement like that. And so you can use it in those senses, but it's also just very beneficial because we didn't talk about the history of it, but this is actually something that Islamic theologians were the prime developers of. And a guy named John Philoponus, who's a Christian, was like the initiator of it, dealing with a guy named Aristotle. And but beyond that, Islamic theologians took it and carried and ran with it for a very long time. Now, that's not to say this doesn't lack any merit because of that. What I'm trying to display by that is that it is not necessarily scripture or text dependent. And so it's something that you can use to talk about God and his existence, the God that we describe or that scripture describes. And it's a good point to have that conversation. And it's not scripture specific, but when we talk about what it is and the type of eternal, powerful, free will, personal being that it describes within this cosmological argument, we can readily move that to scripture and the type of God that scripture describes, and even the personal, loving nature and the gospel that he accomplished through Christ to free us, ultimately, to set us free, to make us right with him.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily the starting point or the ending point for apologetic conversations, but it's a good, I guess, stepping stone in that sense, especially with skeptics and atheists. Someone who already believes in God, whether it's probably the typical American is someone who believes God, but they don't necessarily follow Christianity or the Bible, right? That's a lot of Americans. This argument doesn't really apply to them. So we need to know how and when to apply this, right? Yeah. It's not meant for someone who already believes in God's existence.
Yeah, it might not be as suitable there, but even if they believe in God's existence and that God that they believe in is this, again, this impersonal force, well, talking to them about how that doesn't work, because that would just create an infinite universe, and we already see that with science and certain philosophical reason that just doesn't pan out. So again, even in a scenario like that, it could funnel somebody down closer to the features of God of the Bible. So it could be valuable. But it may not always be something that you need to do. It's not like there is just this set structure. And kind of what we started out with is this classical apologetics approach where you argue for God's existence and then move to the historical resurrection to present, God's plan of salvation. But you may not end up needing that. Somebody may have questions about who Jesus is or why you think Jesus is actually existent or is God or any other number of things.
In that case, this argument's not going to apply.
Probably not going to apply very much. So this is for the skeptic that thinks science or something like that has removed God from the equation, which given things like the infinite regress and the nature of the being and what we see and things having a starting point in time, those are strong points to say, well, there has to be something outside of this to have ever begun and created any of this material that you're talking about and discussing to have done anything. It had to have a starting point, and your particular worldview with materialism doesn't give anything outside of time and space to have created time and space, which is absolutely necessary.
So say someone uses this in a conversation with their coworker or neighbor or family member that's a skeptic,
Yeah.
and they run into an objection. What do you think are some objections they might run into? Because we don't want to just send you out there, say,
Yeah.
here's a great argument, and not tell you how someone's going to respond to it, right?
Yeah, I think so. This is definitely the biggest one, which is, well, if God created the universe, then who created God?
Mhm.
So that's one of the primary objections I think people would have to deal with.
And then at objection, we can just go back to the premises. Everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Yeah.
Does the God of Christianity begin to exist?
And we never said that about him, right?
Exactly. That doesn't apply because he's not something that began to exist. He's someone who is, as you mentioned earlier, timeless and spaceless.
Yeah.
So that objection doesn't apply to God because he exists outside of time. He never began to exist. He's always been.
Yeah.
He is the great I am.
Yeah. And that's that necessity that you spoke of earlier is very much the same thing. This is what you're talking about with that necessity. It is necessary that there is an eternally existing something for anything to ever begin to exist. There has to be a jump-off point, so to speak, for things that begin to exist. But you can never get to beginning to exist again without something having caused it, and that cause must be eternal.
Yep.
To ever begin again, we're not sitting here at this point in time if we're never beginning, if we're never starting, we don't get the opportunity to travel through a sequence of events that bring us to this particular moment in time. And we never have a starting point. We have an infinite regress problem. We're always going, well, then who created God? And then it's like, well, who created whatever created God? And then it's like, well, who created whatever created God? And you just constantly going back, never getting a point at which things can jump off or begin.
I mean, we don't want to get into a tangent, but that's exactly the problem that classical Mormonism runs into with their idea that Joseph Smith taught towards the end of his life was that God had a God.
Mm-hmm.
And who's that God's God?
Yeah.
And it's just an infinite regress problem. This is something they've talked about before, but we don't need to get into that problem.
And I guess that would be a good point to bring up with Mormons, because these conversations could occur with Mormons, and you're running into plurality and a multiplicity of different universes that other people that began to exist, they traveled through life in such an ideal way, and they were honored and deified in their life, and then they populate and create a new universe, and it's back and back and back. So eventually you need a point at which there's something that always existed eternally and started to create and began existence for things that are created and begin to exist.
I think we have time for maybe one more objection. Not to say that there's only two objections. There are numerous objections that someone could come up with this.
Yeah.
But maybe address one more that's most likely to come up.
I think this is so with physics and stuff like that. I couldn't go in some great depth on physics. I'm not a physicist or anything like that. But in like these quantum vacuums, it'll be suggested that things begin to exist without a cause. And that's not, that's like saying these things begin to exist and come out of nothingness into existence. And we can't measure, predict, or whatever these quantum particles are going to say pop into existence. But that doesn't mean that they are popping into existence out of nothing. In fact, they're within physical rules. They're within these containers that have certain things that exist and have begun to exist, like physical rules that govern them. So it's not really nothingness that these things are actually coming from. I wrote an analogy, or I have an analogy down here, and I think that might help. And I couldn't remember exactly how it went, so I'm just going to read it. So, the quantum objection is like saying a lottery drawing has no cause just because the winning numbers are unpredictable. The drawing itself still requires a machine, balls, and rules already in place. So that's kind of what it's saying. There's still this structure around these things that are happening. So that's not nothingness. That's not things popping into existence outside of out of nothingness.
On a universal scale, if there's nothing at some point, there's no structure or requirements or necessity that can be met in order for something to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So that would necessarily imply, like we mentioned earlier, a personal, timeless, spaceless being to set these requirements into motion.
Yeah. I guess the problem always ends up being you end up having to kick the can further
Someone's
down the
kicking
road.
the can down the road unless you posit an eternal being, and it has to be a personal being. Otherwise, it doesn't know how to create or meet or meet these requirements necessary for the things that begin to exist.
Yeah. Or the universe looks just like him, or whatever the case may be. Yeah, you have all these different anomalies, which definitely in this argument point to a personal agent with free will that existed outside of the universe that he created, so outside of time and space, and has choice to create at a specific moment in time and create something that is separate from him, that is different than him. Not something that is, say, just some fragmentation of him or a set of conditions or anything like that.
So this has been the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. Just to summarize real quick, premise 1 is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, and that leads us to the conclusion that the universe has a cause. Yeah. And it must be a personal God. We don't need to get into the details again.
Yeah, we've kind of addressed the details already.
But it has to be a personal being. And because of that, this argument is a very useful argument for people who don't want you to go to the Bible, which if
we
they
want
say
to
that,
move there.
You still want to get to the Bible.
Yeah, we want to move there.
But this is a good starting point as a stepping stone to get there, because this is, okay, we at least know that there must be a God. Yeah. And that gets us to, okay, how do we know it's the God of Christianity? And that's something we can get to in future episodes. Is how do we get to Christianity specifically? Yeah. Well, like, comment, subscribe, share. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, and hit this is something we haven't been saying, but they need to hit some kind of bell reminder or something like
hit
that.
The notification bell.
Notification bell, that's it. Hit it.
Yeah, so you're notified when we upload. Have a blessed one.